Before we go into today's deep dive, please remember to subscribe, share, and like this video, as it really does help us reach a wider audience. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to discover that fuel prices had suddenly surged, supermarket shelves were becoming more expensive, airlines were cancelling flights, and stock markets around the world were falling sharply. Now imagine discovering that all of it could be traced back to one narrow stretch of water that many people have never even heard of. A place so small that on a world map it is almost invisible. Yet every single day, some of the largest ships ever built pass through it, carrying the energy that powers factories, heats homes, fuels aircraft, transports goods, and keeps the global economy moving. It is called the Strait of Hormuz. To some, it is simply another shipping lane. To military planners, it is one of the most strategically important pieces of water on Earth. To energy traders, it is perhaps the single most important choke point in the global economy. And to governments around the world, it represents both prosperity and vulnerability. Whenever tensions rise in this region, financial markets react almost instantly. Oil prices fluctuate, shipping insurers reassess risk, governments begin emergency planning, military vessels move into position. Because history has repeatedly demonstrated one uncomfortable truth. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, the consequences will not remain in the Middle East. They will spread across the globe. So tonight, we are asking one simple question. Could one waterway really change the world? To answer that, we first need to understand why this place matters so much. Stand on the coastline overlooking the Strait of Hormuz, and at first glance, it appears remarkably ordinary. To the north lies Iran. To the south, the Mazandaran Peninsula, part of Oman. Between them sits a relatively narrow stretch of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and beyond that, the Arabian Sea and the wider Indian Ocean. It doesn't look like the center of the global economy, yet appearances can be deceiving. Almost every oil-producing nation bordering the Persian Gulf depends upon this passage. Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields, Kuwait, Iraq, Bahrain, Qatar, much of the United Arab Emirates, and of course Iran itself. For decades, enormous quantities of crude oil, petroleum products, and liquefied natural gas have traveled through these waters every single day. Although some alternative pipelines now exist, none currently possess enough capacity to replace the strait entirely. That means a disruption here quickly becomes a disruption almost everywhere. Recent events have demonstrated precisely how fragile that system remains. Commercial shipping has already been affected by renewed regional conflict. Energy markets have reacted sharply. Governments have begun coordinating maritime security operations. Military aircraft patrol overhead. Warships escort commercial vessels. Insurance premiums have risen, all because of one stretch of water. But how did the world allow itself to become so dependent upon a place that has experienced repeated political and military crises? To answer that, we need to go back long before oil was ever discovered, long before supertankers crossed these waters, long before pipelines stretched across deserts, long before the modern states surrounding the Gulf even existed. The Strait of Hormuz was already changing history. For centuries, it served as one of the world's great trading crossroads. Merchants traveled between Persia, India, East Africa, and Arabia, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, ceramics, and textiles. Control of these routes meant wealth, and wealth inevitably attracted empires. During the early 16th century, Portugal became one of the first European powers to recognize the strategic importance of the region. Having established sea routes around Africa into the Indian Ocean, Portuguese forces captured the island kingdom of Hormuz. Their objective was simple: control trade, control taxation, control the gateway between East and West. For over a century, they dominated maritime commerce throughout much of the region, but they would not remain there forever. In the early 17th century, the Safavid Persian Empire, supported by English East India Company naval forces, drove the Portuguese from Hormuz. That partnership would prove historically significant, because although Britain had initially entered these waters primarily to protect commercial interests, its influence would gradually expand far beyond trade. Over the next 3 centuries, Britain became the dominant external naval power throughout much of the Gulf. Officially, British policy focused on protecting maritime trade routes to India. Unofficially, It also secured influence over one of the world's most strategically valuable regions. Britain negotiated treaties with local rulers, protected shipping, suppressed piracy, established political relationships that, in many cases, still shape the Gulf today. It is tempting to think of today's Middle East as ancient and unchanging. In reality, much of its modern political geography is surprisingly recent. Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the Emirates that would eventually form the United Arab Emirates all developed within a regional order heavily influenced by British diplomacy, naval power, and protectorate agreements. That does not mean Britain simply invented these nations. Their histories stretch back centuries. Their ruling families possess their own identities and political legitimacy. But British policy profoundly influenced how many of their modern borders, international relationships, and security arrangements developed. Even Jordan, although geographically outside the Gulf itself, emerged from the post-First World War settlement that followed the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Britain helped shape the regional political order that would dominate much of the 20th century. At the time, few could have imagined what lay beneath the desert sands. Because once oil entered the story, everything changed. The discovery of commercially viable oil transformed the Persian Gulf forever. What had once been an important maritime trading region suddenly became the center of global industrial civilization. Factories required energy, ships required fuel, cars required petrol, aircraft required aviation fuel. Modern economies increasingly depended upon petroleum. The Gulf possessed enormous quantities of it. By the middle of the 20th century, international energy companies were investing heavily throughout the region. American firms entered Saudi Arabia. British interests remained deeply involved in Iranian oil. New pipelines stretched across deserts, ports expanded, refineries multiplied. Entire national economies became intertwined with the global energy market. Perhaps no company symbolizes that transformation more than Aramco. Originally established through an American concession agreement with Saudi Arabia, the company gradually evolved into what is now Saudi Aramco, one of the world's largest and most valuable energy producers. Its rise reflected something much bigger than corporate success. It demonstrated how control of energy had become inseparable from political influence. Oil was no longer simply a commodity, it had become power, and whoever controlled production controlled leverage. The 1970s would reinforce that lesson dramatically. When Arab producers imposed oil embargoes following the Arab-Israeli War, much of the industrialized world experienced fuel shortages, inflation, and economic disruption. Governments suddenly realized something they had perhaps underestimated. Military strength alone could not guarantee economic security. Energy security mattered just as much. That lesson remains painfully relevant today. Because while technologies have changed, the world's dependence upon energy has not disappeared. If anything, modern economies have become even more interconnected. Manufacturing, agriculture, aviation, shipping, digital infrastructure. Virtually every aspect of modern life still depends, directly or indirectly, upon reliable energy supplies. And much of that energy still passes through one remarkably narrow corridor. Yet while Gulf monarchies were becoming wealthier through oil, another country was moving in a very different direction: Iran. And understanding Iran is essential to understanding why today's tensions continue. To understand today's confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, you first have to understand modern Iran, because from Tehran's perspective, today's tensions did not begin with missiles, sanctions, or nuclear negotiations. They began decades earlier. Perhaps even centuries earlier. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Persia, as Iran was then known, found itself caught between competing imperial powers. Britain sought to protect its route to India and secure access to Persian oil. Russia pushed southwards in search of influence. Neither power wanted the other dominating the region. Caught in the middle was Persia itself. Then, in the early 20th century, something happened that would change the country's destiny forever. Oil was discovered. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later known as British Petroleum or BP, secured rights to exploit enormous reserves. To Britain, it was an extraordinary strategic victory. The Royal Navy was transitioning from coal to oil. Reliable supplies became a matter of national security. To many Iranians, however, the arrangement represented something entirely different. Foreign companies were becoming wealthy from Iranian resources, while ordinary Iranians saw comparatively little benefit. Those grievances would simmer for decades. Eventually, they exploded. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry. To many Iranians, it was an act of sovereignty. To Britain, it represented the loss of one of its most valuable overseas assets. Diplomatic relations deteriorated rapidly, economic pressure increased. Then, in 1953, Mossadegh was removed from power in a coup supported by British and American intelligence services. The Shah returned with strong Western backing. From Washington and London, the Shah represented stability. From the perspective of many Iranians, he increasingly came to symbolize foreign influence over Iranian affairs. This distinction matters enormously because without understanding it, it becomes impossible to understand modern Iran's worldview. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 did not emerge in isolation. It emerged from decades of political tension, economic resentment, and competing visions of Iran's future. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile, everything changed. The Shah fled, the monarchy collapsed, Iran became an Islamic republic. Then came the hostage crisis. American diplomats were held inside the United States Embassy in Tehran for 444 days. Relations between Washington and Tehran collapsed almost overnight. Sanctions followed. Diplomatic isolation intensified. Mutual distrust hardened. More than 4 decades later, neither side has ever truly escaped that confrontation. For successive American administrations, Iran became a state whose nuclear ambitions, regional activities, and support for armed groups demanded economic and diplomatic pressure. For successive Iranian governments, sanctions became proof that Western powers sought to weaken Iran regardless of who governed it. Neither narrative fully explains the other. Both contain elements of truth, and both continue shaping events today. That is one of the defining principles of international politics. History rarely disappears, it accumulates. Every generation inherits unresolved disputes from the previous one. Nowhere demonstrates that more clearly than the Persian Gulf. If sanctions represented one form of pressure, geography provided another. Iran's leaders understood something that few other countries possess. They could not match the United States militarily. They could not outspend Saudi Arabia. They could not outproduce the Gulf monarchies. But they controlled half of the world's most important maritime gateway. The Strait of Hormuz became strategic leverage. Whenever pressure increased, Iranian officials reminded the world that they possessed options. Sometimes those warnings remained rhetorical. Sometimes they became far more tangible. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, both countries began targeting commercial shipping in what became known as the tanker war. Oil tankers, merchant vessels, port infrastructure. Nothing appeared entirely safe. Insurance premiums soared. International concern grew. Eventually, the United States agreed to escort reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Gulf. Operation Earnest War became one of the largest naval escort operations since the Second World War. It demonstrated something that remains true today. Protecting shipping through Hormuz is not simply a regional issue. It quickly becomes an international military operation. The confrontation escalated further. American warships struck Iranian offshore installations. Iran deployed mines. Commercial vessels were damaged. Then came one of the darkest moments in the Gulf's modern history. In 1988, the USS Vincennes mistakenly shot down Iran Air Flight 655. 290 civilians lost their lives. For many outside the region, it became another tragic accident. For many inside Iran, it became lasting evidence that great powers could act with devastating consequences and never fully understand how those actions would be remembered. Even today, references to Flight 655 continue appearing in Iranian political discourse. Again, history accumulates. It does not disappear. Over the following decades, the Gulf experienced repeated crises. Tankers were seized, mines were discovered, commercial vessels reported attacks, the British-flagged Steny Impero was detained. Drone strikes targeted Saudi oil infrastructure. International naval patrols expanded. Each incident reinforced the same reality. The Strait of Hormuz had become one of the world's most sensitive geopolitical fault lines. Today, that reality remains unchanged. Iran maintains significant naval forces around Bandar Abbas, its principal naval base overlooking the northern side of the strait. Rather than relying on one enormous fleet capable of matching the United States Navy ship for ship, Iran developed an asymmetric strategy: fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, coastal batteries, drones, submarines. The objective is not necessarily to defeat larger navies, it is to make operating inside the strait increasingly dangerous. Military planners refer to this as anti-access strategy. It aims to increase uncertainty, increase costs, increase political risk, because even temporary disruption can produce enormous economic consequences, and those consequences extend far beyond the Gulf. Perhaps the biggest misconception surrounding the Strait of Hormuz is that only countries importing Gulf oil should worry about it. That simply isn't true. Whether you live in Europe, North America, South America, Africa, Asia, or Oceania, your household is connected to Hormuz, not because every liter of fuel originates there, but because energy markets are global, oil is traded internationally. When supply falls, prices often rise. Higher energy prices increase transport costs. Transport costs affect food, manufacturing, construction, air travel, shipping, electricity generation. Even products containing plastics and synthetic materials become more expensive. Businesses absorb some of those increases. Consumers absorb the rest. The result is familiar to households almost everywhere. Fuel becomes more expensive. Food becomes more expensive. Flights become more expensive. Inflation becomes more persistent. Central banks respond. Interest rates change. Investment slows. Economic growth weakens. One narrow waterway, one global chain reaction. This is why financial markets watch Hormuz so closely. They are not simply watching ships, they are watching the global economy. Naturally, many governments have asked the obvious question: can the world bypass Hormuz altogether? The answer is partly, but only partly. Saudi Arabia has pipelines reaching the Red Sea. The United Arab Emirates operates infrastructure, reducing some reliance on the strait. Additional routes exist, yet together they still cannot replace the enormous daily volumes normally transported through Hormuz. And even after leaving the Gulf, another obstacle appears: the Red Sea. Ships traveling towards Europe typically continue through Bab el-Mandeb before entering the Suez Canal. If security deteriorates there as well, or if commercial considerations make Suez impractical, vessels may need to sail around southern Africa. Thousands of additional miles, additional fuel, additional crew costs, additional insurance, additional delays. Every extra day increases costs. Eventually, those costs reach consumers. Again, the consequences are global. So could one waterway really change the world? Looking purely at geography, perhaps not. Looking at history, absolutely. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a body of water. It is the meeting point of empire, energy, trade, politics, military power, and economics. For more than 500 years, outside powers have competed for influence here: Portugal, Persia, Britain, the United States. Regional powers, global corporations, each believed controlling this gateway protected something vital: trade, empire, energy, national security. Today, the names have changed, the technology has changed, the ships have changed, but the underlying struggle remains remarkably familiar. Who controls the gateway? Controls influence. Who controls influence shapes events far beyond the Gulf. So perhaps the better question was never whether one waterway could change the world. History has already answered that. The real question is whether the world has learned enough from history to stop depending so heavily upon a single narrow corridor, because until it does, every crisis in the Strait of Hormuz will continue sending shockwaves far beyond the Middle East into financial markets, into governments, into businesses, and ultimately into homes across the globe. That doesn't mean another global economic crisis is inevitable. It does mean that one of the world's greatest vulnerabilities remains unresolved. And until that changes, the Strait of Hormuz will remain one of the most strategically important places on Earth, not because of its size, but because of the extraordinary weight the modern world has placed upon it. That completes today's deep dive. Remember to like, subscribe, and share this video if you found it informative. It genuinely helps independent journalism reach a wider audience. I'm Alexander Jones Redway. This has been the JR Voice, and I'll see you in the next one.